Hello?
Hello, Kathryn?
Yes.
Hi, this is David Bolton calling.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Very well, thank you.
Good. How's the weather on the other island over there?
Well, where are you calling from?
Kauai.
Oh, yeah, well, I think it just turned sunny. It's been a little cool, so I'm still sitting here with socks on my feet.
Me too. It's just strange. The last 2 or 3 days, it's been chilly.
Well, we went from very hot weather to very cool weather for the island, so that's kind of a drastic shift for us.
Right. When I talk to the people on the East Coast and I mention that it's a little chilly here, they don't have any sympathy, though.
No, their idea of chilly is, below freezing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I appreciate.
Well, I'm flattered that you're considering me for this project. I'm not sure that what I have to say is something that will fit, but let's talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, anything that's a kind of an important and legitimate angle of view and understanding on the challenge to the individual child and to our society as a whole in the learning to read process is relevant and important and something that I'm interested in and seeking. So I think you've got a lot.
Thanks for saying that.
I've got a lot. I think you've got a lot to bring to this, and I'm looking forward to unfolding that together and seeing. I'm interested in learning from you, and I'm interested in making sure that the kind of dimensions of concern that you bring to this are part of what we're doing.
Well, thanks for saying that, because I guess from what I've done before that I feel like the work with the code needs to be put in a bigger context, or kids won't be getting it. So
I agree, and there's a nested level of challenge here that goes all the way from the unnaturalness of code processing to the human brain to the extra and additional encumbrances that come because the way that we approach this is not linguistically and culturally relevant to the children that are struggling to get up in it. So, I mean, there's a huge spectrum here.
Yeah, well said, well said.
And I'm interested in all of it.
Good for you.
Okay. All right. So having said that, let me also say that as I mentioned to you in the email, I am recording this. This is a phone interview, and I will send you a copy of the transcript of this when we get it transcribed. We're still not backed up on that, and that parts of this may appear in articles or things that we're doing, so that you're aware of that. Okay. All right, so let's move on, and let me ask you, first of all, who you are and what passions you. How is it that you find yourself in this work? And then from there, let's talk a little bit about what your core, central, vision and thought is about reading.
Well, I started my career as a kindergarten, first, and second grade teacher. I was working at Kamehameha Schools, which, as you know, is a large private institution here. And at that time, they had a research and development program called the Kamehameha Elementary Education Program. So my students were underprivileged kids, mostly from the housing projects of Kalihi, and they were primarily of Hawaiian ancestry. So I was a teacher of beginning reading, and I really got to know the kids and their struggles, and that's what started me to look at other than the then conventional ways of teaching reading. I went from being a classroom teacher to being a curriculum developer, researcher, and teacher educator. And I guess that's
when you
the
say
long and short of it.
Okay, so something about experiencing the challenges and frustrations of the children drove you, and I'm going to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you came in there and then went further into learning about these various dimensions of education, so that you'd be, better equipped to come back to this space of the struggle that children are having.
I guess if you want to put it more in terms of conventional academic disciplines, I'm an educational psychologist by training, and I started out actually as an experimental psychologist. But when I was working at KEEP, we also had on staff anthropologists and linguists. So I had a good exposure to anthropology and sociolinguistics. And that broadened my perspective, I think, from the usual perspective that one would have as an experimental psychologist. So that's why I think I developed a broader view of the issues.
Right, but underneath that, underneath your academic directions, there was an inner motivation, which was
Definitely.
to try to make all of this and somehow more relevant and accessible for children, less damaging.
Yes, yes.
Okay, and again, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but
No, but
I always like to
right.
connect. I like to connect with the heart of people, where they're coming from, why do they do this?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think if I had not had that classroom experience, that it would have been easier for me, excuse me, to fall into the trap of thinking that there was an easy answer to this situation, and that the answer was going to be phonics and phonics alone.
Right. Yeah, yeah. Very few people understand that phonics is just a code patch that evolved 400 years ago because the code was a mess. I mean, it's not in itself a right thing. It's like saying a Band-Aid's a right thing or something.
Yeah, it's a definite piece of the puzzle, but it's a much smaller piece, I think, than we typically believe.
Yeah, it's got to be put into a different context for sure. Okay, so thank you very much. That's helpful getting some background. Let's talk then about your work today, and you connect it wherever you want to, but take me into the very heart of the distinctions that you live with about what's most important in this learning to read space.
Well, today what I do is I run a teacher education program that recruits residents of the Leeward Coast to become, primarily Native Hawaiians, to become teachers in their own community. So I continue to work in schools and in communities where kids typically struggle as readers in school. And my job is to help these teachers to get a faster start than I got, I guess, when I was a teacher, by sharing with them the bigger picture of reading and the strategies that I think will help them to be very effective with kids in the classroom. So I'm trying to bring the research into a very practical perspective on a daily basis.
Okay, in your articles and in your email to me, you mentioned, and it appears that you're one of your central focuses in this is trying to create a better understanding and appreciation and bridging between the learning to read process and the very divergent needs of children that come with different linguistic, cultural backgrounds.
Exactly.
So can we talk a bit about kind of your theoretical model of how linguistic and cultural variation in children needs to be met by education? In other words, I mean, from my view, I would see that in the process of learning to read, we need to develop a personally relevant stairway into it, and that the relevancy of the stairway has to be both in terms of the challenge of code processing at this more mechanical level, but it also has to go through a space where the content complexity, the kind of language, the kind of meanings are relevant to the individual child's background. And
exactly.
To the
I guess the theoretical framework that I operate from says that our overarching goal for reading and writing instruction is not just proficiency, it's ownership of literacy. So ownership of literacy means that we want students to value literacy so much that they make it part of their everyday lives, at home as well as at school, and that they use reading and writing literacy for their own purposes that they choose for themselves. In other words, it becomes part of them and a tool that helps them to be more effective at home, at school, in the job, wherever, as family members. So that's a different perspective from saying we want kids to be proficient readers and writers, because to me proficiency means that I could have all these strategies and skills. It doesn't mean that I find them meaningful or that I actually ever use them. Right.
And at the same time, I mean, according to the, NAP reports here in Hawaii, we're talking about, 65% or so of the children that are below proficient in the way that they think about it.
Yeah, and I think that the reason that we don't get to proficiency is we don't focus on ownership first. In other words, if I have no idea of the larger purposes for reading and writing.
Sure.
I'm not going to be motivated to learn reading and writing. That's going to hinder my ability to learn skills and strategies and phonics and comprehension and everything else.
So there has to be a sense of the big picture importance of it to the individual's life. And then, but even that, I mean, you can have an idea that it's important in the long run, and that can, buffer or bolster up attention span to struggle with it. But in order to operationalize the relevancy of it, the content of the on-ramp also has to reflect.
Yeah, I think both. Well, see, you're a very smart guy. I can tell that already. It has to do both with the process and the content.
Yes.
So the process means making school ways of learning more accessible to kids and more familiar by relating them to home ways of learning. And the content means trying to provide high-interest content that students will find cultural connections to.
Yeah, but by definition, its interest is related to how relevant it is to their backgrounds.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody, finds it easier to learn something when you have interest and motivation, and all of us have been in boring situations where, we were there, but we weren't really learning because we just saw no point to it.
Right. We weren't active participants. We were passengers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, see, when I step back, I say, okay, I get the fact that we've got to create. I have another angle on this that I like to think of as well. First of all, kids have to realize that, yes, learning to read and write is of critical life importance to them. It's not an option. It's not like playing music or playing basketball or something like this. It's a rite of passage necessity for being happy and successful in the world today. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it's a radically unnatural thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also important in that sense that children have the awareness that they are likely to struggle with it. It's okay that they're struggling with it. No other animal ever did anything like it. For the majority of human evolution, very few humans have ever done it. It's not built into their brains. It's not. It's an artificial process, and it's a struggle to do it. So that they have a counterbalance to alleviate some of the shame pressure that comes along. I mean, as you know, the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and others say that really the first consequence of protracted reading difficulty is self-blame and resulting shame. Mm-hmm. And of course, shame is fundamentally cognitively disruptive. Right. It undermines the ability to do the work. So we both got to create a motivational force that says this is incredibly important, critical, not optional.
Yeah, and that motivation, that ownership, keeps kids moving and keeps them trying, even when the going gets rough. When the going gets rough, right? And then, like I said, the second piece there, for me anyway, is to create a buffer against the shame by contextualizing this as yes, it's going to be difficult, and no, there's nothing wrong with you if you're struggling with it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then from there we go to, okay, once we've got a motivational metaframe, and we have a shame detoxing kind of awareness, then the next step is what's the on-ramp itself, and how do we unfold these challenges so that they can develop the kind of cognitive technology, the artificial structures in the brain that have to grow in order to process the code, and that can happen inside of a content field of flow that's interesting and engaging to them. Otherwise, their lack of interest in the process can really do damage to them when we're trying to beat this machine into them. So it's tracking with you? Yes.
So when you talk to the children here in Hawaii, and as you said before, one of your primary things is to pump up the motivation and to help teachers understand this. How is it that you I mean, what's some of the experiences with children that you've actually had, or with teachers and their children that have actually had, that you feel really exemplify the opportunities for success that come with creating more relevant, linguistically and culturally relevant reading experiences?
Well, I can tell you about what happened to me very early in my career as a beginning kindergarten teacher that kind of made me see that the usual way wasn't going to work. I realized right away that kids needed to learn letter sounds. But what we found when we did it the usual way, we were using an old program called the GIN 360 at that time, which was the most widely used basal reader program in the United States. And we taught initial consonant sounds. It took kids just as long to learn the first ones in the sequence as the ones later in the sequence. And what that told us was that we had no learning to learn effect. In other words, the kids were rote learning these things, and they saw absolutely no sense to it at all.
Right.
So we knew that we couldn't start with letters. What we had to do was we had to start with, why is it going to be a good idea to learn to read at all? We knew that many of our children came to school without having had the experience of family storybook reading. And in those days, preschools were even less available in Hawaii than they are now. So we found that, you had to start with something that was meaningful and sensible to the kids. So reading aloud and getting them interested in reading books is always going to be a first step. Another important thing to follow up with that, once they're interested in books, is doing shared reading of big books, that is, books with enlarged text, so they get the ability to see the teacher tracking the print in a whole class. Now, the other part of it that becomes very important is the connections to writing, because we can't rely on the fact that kids have had a lot of book experience. What we do know is that they all come to school with life experience. So teaching them to write about those life experiences, or doing what Calkins calls writing from the heart, is often the first step towards literacy for many of our kids in school.
Yeah, creating a training wheels effect by staying relevant.
Right, exactly. So you can start by having kids write about things that are important to them. They don't need to write in the sense that we think of writing. They just need to represent their words on paper, so that can be through drawings in the beginning. And then later those drawings will evolve into pictures with labels, and later pictures with sentence captions, and then the stories will begin to take over.
Kind of recapitulating the history of writing humanity as a whole.
Exactly. Ontogeny does recapitulate phylogeny in that case.
Right. And again, allowing the form to unfold and follow the desire to articulate, to express, and to get outside of themselves with something that's inside of themselves.
Because what emergent literacy research tells us again and again is that children follow surprisingly individual and inventive paths to becoming proficient readers and writers. And when we let them show us the path that they're on, we can more easily lead them to the next step than if we try to guess what that path is. We just need to be very observant and then build our lessons around where we can see them coming from.
Right. Which I totally agree with that. I totally agree with there's a body of science related to affects, which deal with what it is that directs cognition. Kind of in the structure of the brain. How is it that we pay attention to one thing and not attention to another thing? And what is it that creates enough of a focal thrust to keep distractions minimized to a task that we're on about? And that all of that comes down to the affect called interest. And that to the extent that we're not interested, our interest isn't at a certain level, then our cognitive machinery, cognitive processing doesn't stay in focus. And so it's incredibly important that we engage children in that way so as to allow them to, pilot themselves through the on-ramp into facility here.
Right.
On the other hand, and this is the kind of counterbalancing point, what they're trying to do when they first develop the interior reflexes associated with code processing is something that's alien to their nature, and it's arbitrary in such a way that it's not something that there's no question that it will form optimally inside the field of something they're interested in. But
well, that's true. But it's with rare exceptions that kids have not been seeing print or been in an environment where some kind of print is accessible to them. So I think that's what we want to bank on. It's not strictly the case that it's an unusual cognitive step for kids to take. But on the other hand, we know that kids are very influenced by their cultural context, so that scribbling by preschoolers is different in Israel, say, than it is in English-speaking countries, and again different from scribbling in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So kids are picking up features of the writing system and understanding functions of literacy even before they're reading and writing in conventional ways. So that's part of what we can bank on.
Right, no question. There is some pre-developed sensibilities and capabilities with respect to this, and there's like you said, there's a life history in them that can connect up to relevant literacy experiences, and that both of these things are vital parts.
Yeah. So I think it depends on how broadly you want to cast the net. So there are people who would say that literacy can even begin in the prenatal stage, because if kids hear, like my brother read Shakespeare to his two sons before they were born. He would sit my sister-in-law down and he would read Shakespeare so that they would get the sound of the printed English language and good English, the best English language, into their ears before they were even born. So you could say that literacy also begins with exposure to any kind of written language, which is different from spoken language. So I guess it depends how broadly you want to think of literacy. So in one sense, you could say that kids have plenty of resources before they start attacking the code, if you look at it that way.
Right. And ultimately, when the reflexes, what I'm trying to do is draw out this, because for me, I see the necessity of all these different layers at once, and I'm trying to understand their relationships, and that's what we're trying to communicate in this series that we're about. I mean, the kind of disambiguation processing that has to go on. I mean, as you know, in the English system in particular, sometimes the sound value of a particular letter in a particular word can't be determined for many words downstream later. Right? Like whether I'm live or live or read or read, there's a loop going on in the processing to work out the ambiguity that's in this code. It's unlike anything the human brain has ever done, or any organism has ever done in the history of life that we can tell.
Well, and that's one of the commonplaces, of course, is that's why psychologists have been so interested in reading, is because it is a window into the human mind, into how people think. And that's really true. Yeah,
it's certainly a window into the kind of recently developed artificial side of the human mind, the code processing side of the human mind. Remember, I'm sure you're aware, all the millions of years we've been here, this code is only 3,500 years old from its inception, and only 10 or 20 generations since enough of it have been using it to even make it evolutionarily noticeable. So the kind of reflexes that are necessary to take in these letters, hold them, so to speak, buffer them in computer language in the brain, while working out their sound values in relation to these rules and in relation to what has already been read, and to do all of this, there's no natural precedent for doing it. And there's a cognitive ambiguity overwhelm. When we watch children reading, as they encounter words that have greater degrees of ambiguity in them in terms of the possible letter sound configurations, they hesitate. I mean, there's a correspondence between the hesitation, starts, stops, and stutters that we hear in the articulation stream of a child reading, and the confusions that are in the code itself that they're reading from. They sync up with each other. And so they definitely need to have this guiding interest to pull them through this work.
Right.
And also we have to recognize that there's aspects of what they're learning to do which is so unnatural that though while their interest will help them and all their prior experiences will help them, they may need other things as well. Enter the conversation about whatever we do that's more systematized. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, all right. I mean, there seems to be such a polarization between the emergent literacy, the people. I mean, one group seems.
Well, let's be clear that the argument is not about whether instruction should be systematic or not.
Okay.
The argument is really about where the basis for that system should come from.
Okay, agree. Good.
Whether the system should come from the signs that are given by the child, or whether the system should come primarily from a task analytic approach that gives us a sequence of steps that a mature reader goes through. And the truth is that it really needs to be an interaction between those two ways of developing a system.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. There's no way that you can, independent of the living child's responses, script their approach to reading. I mean, you have to consider them and what their actual experience is and what's confusing them and all the rest of it. And we're totally in alignment there.
On the other hand, we also want to bring to bear what we know, that kids will look at the first letter of a word before they'll look at the last letter of a word and those kinds of things. So, I think it is definitely an interaction between those two sources of knowledge.
So the polarities that seem to be existing, get that off. Sorry about that.
Seem to be between one group that seems to be saying, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I want to draw this out, that human beings are meaning-centric. I mean, what makes something relevant and interesting to us is that it's meaningful to us. And the sooner that we can get children into experiencing things that are meaningful to them, the better they're going to learn their way through that to wherever it is we want them to be going. And that has been the underlying logic, I think, of the kind of whole language movement. That by working with high relevancy and high meaning and reducing wherever possible, unnecessarily complex content at certain stages, that the children will learn the interior code processing they need by having repeated good experiences of tracking the meaning. Is that similar?
Well, not quite. I mean,
Okay.
I think what happens is that the teacher will pick up on the areas where the kids are ready to learn skills or needing the skills, and will provide instruction on the basis of evidence that the kids are lacking in those skills. So the idea is there is skill instruction, but it tends to be more within the context of the activities that kids are doing and what they're showing the need for.
Okay, good. I appreciate that build. Yeah, I totally agree with it. So on the other side is a group that basically says this code processing is a radically unnatural thing for the brain to be doing, and there needs to be a series of kind of very systematized instructions that allow them to repeatedly exercise towards being successful in these discretely identified building block skills. And that seems to be the more, phonics and more of what's coming out of Washington today.
Right.
Is that so?
Bottom-up view.
Yeah. Okay. And what I hear you advocating is both are necessary, that we need to establish the kind of metaframe, the motivational backdrop, and then deal with the code building block skills as they appear to be needed based on evidence from the child that they're at that stage of the struggle?
Well, you can do that, and you can also have systematic skill instruction that you just take kids through in a set sequence, provided the motivation is there. But the essential thing is that it has to make sense to the kids why we need to learn skills. And I really believe that the love of reading and writing and understanding what books are about and the possibilities for expressing my own thoughts and ideas, can be the driving force behind that. So I'm not, the older I get less set on an exact way of teaching phonics, because I see success with different approaches to it.
Mm-hmm.
That some I don't necessarily agree with, but if some teacher finds that effective and it works for her, I think that she should have the right to teach that way. So I just think that it's still the idea that there is a necessary amount of attention that needs to go to motivation, meaning making, and comprehension, along with the skills emphasis.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think that's right down the center of everything. It's certainly how we're inclined to think about it in terms of the project and what we're doing and how we're trying to explore the different opinions and perspectives in this space.
Well, I think that's an admirable challenge, because the world of reading has become such a polarized field with a black or white, a left or right orientation, that it becomes very difficult to try to present the more complex picture that I think more accurately reflects what quality reading instruction would be like, especially for students of diverse backgrounds.
Right. Yes. Excellent. I don't know to what extent this touches on you. I mean, it seems as if the government at the moment has taken the position that through the Office of the Institute of Educational Science and the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and the legislation that's been passed on reading first and such, that the evidence is showing that the systematic approach that they have advocated, even though they wouldn't say it's a singular system, it's a whole menu of possible alternative systems, but the systems that seem to be working according to their research are these more skill-intensive, and that rather than try to engage in but certainly rather depend on engaging with the teaching community and developing a dialogue so that we're all learning together here, they've legislated a series of incentives and penalties to force education and schools to move in a particular direction here.
Right. Now, I guess again, at the risk of sounding like a very middle-of-the-road person, I really like to refer people to the Statement on Beginning Reading Instruction issued by the International Reading Association. And the gist of that statement is that we have hundreds of studies of beginning reading, and what we know is that every approach that has ever been tried has been successful with some children and unsuccessful with others. So there is no evidence that there is any one best way to teach all children the code of beginning reading. So, a school making a decision about a program is going to make its best guess, but it's really going to depend on the expertise of the teacher in the classroom to see what adaptations to that approach may be needed to reach each and every child in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a combination, yes, of understanding the big picture and what different programs have to offer, but I think we also have to place a lot of attention and confidence in, we hope, the expertise of the classroom teacher to reach the needs of every child, because it's not going to be a program that will reach every child. It's going to be the teacher using the best program that fits at that school and adapting that program to reach the kids that the program just off the shelf or out of the box won't reach.
Right. And when I talk with Dr. Lyon, his view is the thing that he thinks is most important isn't the instructional methodologies, it isn't the instructional packages, It's getting the teachers to ask certain fundamental questions in their own experience of what it is these children are going through. What is reading? To actually get out of being kind of robotic extensions of anybody's program and first person learn their way in to learning to read. When I talked to Russ Whitehurst at the Institute of Educational Sciences, his slant seems to be he thinks teachers are coming with their good hearts, and that because there's such a misperception of this code and the kind of challenge there is to it, he doesn't think we can get the teacher population, to understand this sufficiently to stop the kind of waste of human potential that's going on when we take a look at the history of our reading problem. So he would come down on the side of advocating, instructional systems. So there's a lot of variation, even on, on any dimension you go here, about what's the right approach. But Washington seems to be animated by the fact that, look, according to the way that we're measuring all this, most of our children are not learning to read well. We've been doing this for hundreds of years, and most of our children are not learning to read well. And it's doing more damage to them psychologically, intellectually, academically, economically than just about anything else that threatens children today. And it's costing our nation more than all the wars and terror, crime, and what have you combined. We got to do something differently. And that's their impetus, I think, for the kind of legislation that's trying to drive this thing into change.
So they don't think that the National Assessment of Educational Progress results are showing any improvement in the money they put in so far?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. I mean, as you know, I mean, it's virtually flatline. I mean, there hasn't been much shown improvement in the past ever since we've been monitoring this.
Oh, the grade 4 and 8 results of the 2002 reading seem to show some improvement. They don't want to. They don't think that improvement is there. I agree the grade 12 is looking bad, but that's not where the beginning reading impact would be.
No, exactly. You wouldn't feel that for a few more years, for sure. Still, I mean, we're talking about a couple of % improvement, right?
Well, I thought it was a little better than that, but I guess that's subject to interpretation. So they feel like so far what the government has done has not been sufficient?
Well, I think that, I'll actually let you read some of these articles as they come out if you're interested in some of these other transcripts. But my sense is that
because I think
they're saying the past legislation from past administrations have left it too open for the states, counties, and schools to interpret what is good reading instruction and what is not, and that the reading first structure is in place to create, I guess it tripled the amount of reading money available in the country, but it's only accessible if you agree to conform to particular ways to teach reading. And at the same time they did that, they installed new ways to assess the performance of schools that create various kinds of penalties if reading isn't been improved. So they've created this kind of vice on both ends to both incent and penalize based on reading performance, and then they've tied that to a kind of menu of choices that are acceptable.
Yeah, but I'm thinking what you said about quoting Reed Lyon was that he wasn't so much in favor of that program approach as he was leaning more towards the ability of teachers to look at individual kids and become more expert at reading in general.
Yes, and I would say that inside of that, what I took him to mean was that the most important thing to get going here is to ignite in teachers a first-person interest in understanding the learning to read challenge. That as things are, because of the confusion associated with the code and the confusion associated with...
What confusion associated with the code?
Well, the code is confusing. I mean, there isn't anybody that doesn't think the code is confusing. I mean, there's Richard Vinesky and a few code scientists who think that with sufficient computer power and analytical adult power, we can make sense of all of its confusions. But there's no...
Well, I think it depends on what level you're going to look for systematicity in the English language. So, there's been a lot of research looking at the idea that if you go below the, you go to the morphemic level, you go to the syllable level, and so on, because lots of people do learn to read effectively, and so it's not just purely that you have to look at the code as more than just the individual letters. And then if you do, of course, decoding by analogy, you begin to see the stabilization of vowels through the consonants that follow, and so on. So there's definitely patterning there.
Right. But it's a pattern that an adult who's studying it can understand, but it's not. But it's nonetheless incredibly ambiguous to the mild.
There's some research to suggest that if you work with kids on just 37 phonograms,